So without further ado, I'll hand over to Professor Rose-Ann Kenny. Now, Rose-Ann is a very distinguished medical gerontologist in Dublin. And as you've heard, she is a member of the Royal Irish Academy, which is great distinction. She leads and instituted the Irish Multidisciplinary Longitudinal Study on Aging. And this is looking long-term at how people age, what they need in that aging process. And of course, all of this has been brought into sharp focus by the current COVID pandemic. It's been a great pleasure to work with Rose-Ann in the production of this document. My role has quite simply been to listen, advise occasionally, and to be the coordinating editor. And it's people like Rose-Ann, and then you'll hear from Richard, who've really done the hard work. So it's a pleasure to hand over to Rose-Ann at this point. Rose-Ann.
Thank you, George. And very welcome to everyone who's logged on this morning. We're over the 100 mark, which is great. I just want to share with you a little bit about the purpose of the report. It's really to get Europe ready for the aging society, which is inevitable, and to avail of the opportunities of this new demographic change while ensuring that we are prepared with respect to health, economics, and environmental issues that may be an inevitable consequence of these demographies. We focused in the report on four main principles: that aging is an opportunity, the import of the life course in biological aging, and very pertinent to the current COVID issues was the use of chronological aging to categorize people and the validity behind that. And then finally, the internalization of costs and benefits, and the import of this approach in the context of cohesion between health and social care policy to ensure that we get the best bang for our buck, as it were, with new policy changes, etc., and the biggest impact, and reduction in any duplication of services. And finally, the evidence that the report is based on is very much embedded in the value, the scientific value of longitudinal studies. So I'm going to touch on these four main principles and some of the components relating to those. Starting with demography. One of the most remarkable indicators of our progress as a society has been the demographic change and extended lifespan that we've seen since, in this chart, since the 1840s, when accurate records started to be kept. And as you can see, there's an exponential increase in life expectancy for all of these countries since 1840. Generally speaking, it's about a 3-month increase in lifespan per year. So life expectancy in 1840 was around 45, and it's now 85. Wow. So this is a remarkable achievement.
Logging in from Russia.
What does this mean? It means that those 65 and above will increase from a 19% of the population in 2016 census up to almost 30% over the next 20 years. That's a huge increase. And the reason that the increase is particularly so in that age cohort, and of course in the over 80s, is the baby boomers of the post-war era. So the over 80s can be expected to increase from 5% in 2016 up to almost 12% in 2040. So are we ready for this?
Yeah.
That means that there are 98 million people in the EU over 65 at the moment, compared to 80 million children over 16. So this is a huge demographic shift. And this change in proportions contributing to populations occurred about 10 years ago on average in Europe. So taking into consideration that life expectancy of the next generation of older adults is likely to surpass that of their parents, it's absolutely necessary for us to foresee and to plan for the challenges that our society will encounter as a result of this demography. In Ireland, these are our demographic expectations, the numbers of people over 65 at the moment, but these will rise over the next 15 years, almost doubling. And likewise, the over 80s will increase to 250,000 by 2036 and 1.6 million by 2051. At an individual level, it is our preference to live longer and fulfill potential and achieve personal fulfillment than to die early. We also afford an opportunity, not just to ourselves, but to society by extended lifespan, by bringing stability to family and society, bringing insight, wisdom, knowledge, problem-solving abilities, but also additional engagement in the community, in the economy, through tax paying and active consumption, consumers. So we do afford an opportunity with respect to advancing age. But it's important to remember that when we're engaging with this concept and striving to ensure healthy extended lifespan as opposed to extended lifespan, we have to start at the beginning almost. It's a life course trajectory. We don't start to engage with this after a certain fixed age of 65, 70, 75. Healthy aging is determined by lifelong exposure and a life course experience and approach is therefore necessary. And this is really shown nicely by this Dunedin study, which is a longitudinal study, meaning that the cohorts in the study are studied at frequent intervals, in this case 2 to 4 years. The study involves 1,000 participants, all born in the same year and followed at regular intervals. So at this stage of the study that I'm going to share this data with, all participants were aged 38. That is, they had the same chronological age of 38 years. But now we're measuring in these forthcoming graphs, the biological aging of the cohort. What was the age of the cells?
Yeah, it should be
trillions
now.
of cells within the cohort. Craig, if you just mute everybody else, that would be very helpful. Thank you. So at a singular chronological age of 38,
Yeah.
look at the broad spread
Yeah,
of biological
I'm trying to take care of it.
Thank you. Some of those aged 38 were biologically functioning 10 years younger than that, as 28-year-olds. But some were almost biologically 50 years of age. And the factors which influenced that cellular difference were socioeconomic circumstances, poverty, stress in childhood, smoking, behaviors within the household such as alcohol, drugs, personal behaviors, likewise alcohol and drugs, depression, very common influencer of these biological trajectories. So biological aging is very different from chronological aging, and that's why the life course is so important, because these are all environmental factors which influence all of the systems. Have I been muted? It was so for all systems. Look at the influence that education has on life expectancy. This is data from the report looking at levels of education. This is equivalent to primary education, secondary education, and tertiary level education between 2007 and 2016. And you can see that there's an increase in life expectancy here, an increase in life expectancy across each of these educational types. However, look at the difference in life expectancy for those who had tertiary level education compared to primary level education alone. A gap in 2007 of 73 years versus almost 81 years, compared to 82 versus 75 almost in 2016. So the gap is narrowing, but that huge difference is still there. One of the consequences of these life course accumulation of biological factors is, of course, multimorbidity with increased age. And this was unmasked again by COVID recently, where we saw that those who had more comorbid conditions were more at risk of the consequences of COVID. And here you can see age and percentage of patients with these with numbers of disorders, even in young age groups. 1 or 2 disorders happen in 10 to 20% of the population, but look at the increase with advancing age in the proportion of people who have 6, 7, or 8 disorders. However, multimorbidity is one thing. The thing that matters to individuals is functional independence, and these multi-morbid conditions ultimately do impact on function, but that we only have 3.5% of people in institutional care requiring that level of care because of functional disability generally as a consequence of multimorbidity. So it's important not to take a homogeneous approach, again, to a chronological age, but to understand the heterogeneity of populations, of course, throughout aging, and to accommodate that heterogeneity with respect to policy. The challenge is in the prevention by midlife interventions and early detection and management. And we have great public health opportunities for impacting on functional aging and on multimorbidity, starting early. Think of reserve capacity as money in the bank. So we start saving money in the bank early, so that when we need to draw on that cash, on that physical and psychological reserve, we have it as aging increases. So enhancing that reserve is really important up to the age of 30 through all of the environmental factors that we saw impacted in the Dunedin study. Maintaining that function by aggressively dealing with what we know works in some instances: lifestyle behaviors, physical activity, diet, reduced weight, etc. Early detection of impairment in, say, glucose or cholesterol. That's what we mean by maintaining function. And then slowing decline and disease progression by having all of that reserve to fall on, in addition to managing those lifestyle behavioral factors after the age of 50. The policy options that we recommended in the report with respect to this was a gap in the 4 Ps, a gap in prediction tools, prevention methods, intervention, and personalized solutions, including biomarkers. And also that we recommended that improved research in this area would allow more understanding of what works and for whom, making a more efficient, tailored approach. And also we recommend that the costs and benefits need to be sufficiently internalized, meaning that we take into context the additional costs and benefits that would be a consequence of lifestyle approach to interventions, and not just a short-term economic vision and approach to any policy changes. Again, just drawing a little bit more from that is the whole chronological approach to aging, using an age as a number. I mean, 82-year-olds run marathons, but another 82-year-old is a very functionally impaired individual with cognitive impairment and dementia in a nursing home. No two 82-year-olds are the same. So to use age as a definitive for anything is not appropriate. And we saw this time and time again during the current pandemic. For example, frailty tools were used to assess whether someone should required more aggressive intervention as a result of COVID infection. And one of the indices used in those tools was chronological age, and it got a weighting of 50%. So at aged 70 or 75, you were already disadvantaged because of your chronological number, even though you might be biologically 10 years younger than that. So we need better ways of introducing assessments for fitness for intervention. We saw how we were poorly prepared with respect to some components of the health systems relevant to infection control. And ironically, the report which was developed and launched in advance of COVID functions very, very much and focuses very much on this. And also we saw the very ageist media coverage, which was experienced during COVID. And this is just some examples of that. Of those ageist approaches to a very heterogeneous cohort. We recommended in the report that anti-discriminatory laws and regulations and public policy options should be engaged to prohibit age and gender discrimination using human rights arguments. And that whereas the current EU Employment Equality Directive deals well with discrimination, age discrimination in the workplace, there is a gap to ensure equality treatment, equal treatment outside the workplace, and an approach based on human rights and social rights would be beneficial. Age is a number and shouldn't be used to categorize individuals. This was another policy and conclusion from the document. High heterogeneity, which I've shared with you, and that arbitrary categorization simply based on chronological age should be considered discriminatory and avoided. And finally, the document very much, as I've said, focuses on evidence, particularly from longitudinal studies, because of the very nature of the contribution of life course, our life experience, our life exposure to environmental factors, to how we age, how we biologically age. And this is, I'm going to end on Ireland's contribution through longitudinal studies, to the pandemic in Ireland. This is a paper from last week's New England Journal of Medicine, which covers COVID-19 and immunity and aging populations, and underscores the import for a new research agenda to inform this area. It makes the point that billions of dollars are flowing into research and development efforts aimed at controlling the virus, but that the pandemic response remains hamstrung by our limited understanding of how to generate effective immunity in older persons. In order to prevent and treat, we need to understand the aging process, but there is insufficient research in this area. Even as the brunt of severe illness from COVID is borne by aging adults, we are navigating partially blind in efforts to develop vaccines and therapies, since we lack knowledge of the mechanisms of immunity to protect this population. But by delineating principles of effective immunity in older persons, we will develop new strategies for a broader disease prevention and control in older people. And they finish by recommending that longitudinal studies are part of that solution. Given that the case fatality rates across different countries were very much related to age, this is age on this axis, case fatality rates here, age a major risk factor. Other risk factors were, of course, obesity, hypertension, diabetes, chronic obstructive lung disease, and multimorbidity. So we in Ireland decided to repurpose the longitudinal study on aging to try and work with policymakers over the last 5 months. It would say the study's been ongoing now for 12 years. It's called TILDA, the Irish Longitudinal Study on Aging. It's a representative population, which means that we can make a plus we've asked detailed questions about childhood with respect to this cohort of people over 50 who represent 1 in 150 people over 50 in Ireland. And it's a very broad brush of information collated, health, social and economic. And we generated 8 or 9 reports in that period of time to help with policy, to inform the demographics of the over 50s in the context of COVID. The high-risk groups that I talked about, obesity, hypertension, comorbidity, COPD, etc. Who are they and where are they in the context of counties so that we could help with local authorities plan services? Physical frailty, because they were indeed one of the most vulnerable groups. Who was physically frail? Where were they? Were they living alone? Were there others? Was there a support network, etc.? Patterns of health service utilization in pre-COVID, so that those planning health services could have some expectation of the impact of the policy changes. The contribution of the over 70s to Irish society became more and more apparent as the pandemic evolved. That language use and the terminology with respect to certain aging cohorts was very negative almost and stereotyping. And we wanted to make the point that older persons make a huge contribution to society in Ireland. And actually, as a result of that report, our colleagues in the English longitudinal study and other longitudinal studies that are part of our family of studies internationally, of which there are 27, did likewise to show the contribution of older persons in each of their societies, because they were each experiencing these same things. Loneliness and social isolation. What was this like pre-COVID? And of course, we're looking at that now post the pandemic. Internet access, very important, because that, of course, was one of our main modes of communication with each other. Well, how accessible was it? And who was it accessible to? And where were they? And where were the gaps? And what are the other things that we could use instead of internet access for those who didn't have that access? We follow people through who are part of the study into nursing home care. So we looked at that cohort in the nursing home sector. What was their experience of being in the sector? And finally, vitamin D. There is very strong circumstantial evidence, and this is work that we've been doing with colleagues in Liverpool, led by John Rhodes. Strong circumstantial evidence that vitamin D reduces the severity, may reduce the severity of the response to COVID, and certainly has a significant impact in randomized control trials on other respiratory infections, both bacterial and viral. So what was deficiency like in Ireland? Where was deficiency? What was the seasonality of deficiency? And we found that 45% of people over the age of 80 are deficient in vitamin D. So it's not toxic at the recommended level. So there's really no reason why we shouldn't be recommending vitamin D, in mine and that is the opinion of many other experts, to reduce the severity if someone is exposed to COVID. So this just gives you an example of how valuable a longitudinal data set like this can be in terms of policy. And we turned this around, these reports, for government within a 5-month period. And I acknowledge the wonderful TILDA team who repurposed themselves and their weekends and probably their families to do that. And now we're looking at the experiences of our participants, the experiences of COVID funded by the Health Research Board, and at early biomarkers, because we have all of that biological data which determined those who developed the infection and the level of severity of the infection determined by early biomarkers in collaboration with an SFI award with TBSI colleagues and TTMI colleagues in Trinity. So aging is an opportunity, etc. High heterogeneity, important to reflect on internalization of costs and benefits, and longitudinal studies are a great way of addressing the evidence base and policy. Now, this is a new report offering a detailed look at 5 research moonshots that the EU will fund significantly to the tune of many billions. Climate, cancer, ocean, soil, cities. They are what are identified as the big challenges for Europe. I put it to you, the audience, and particularly to our esteemed next, one of our speakers, Vice President Mairead McGuinness, that we should also be reflecting on aging as a major challenge for Europe going forward. Thank you.
Good. Roseanne, thank you very much. That was a terrific start to the meeting. A clear example of how assembling data and information, using that from a scientific basis, can be used to help our societies and inform the future. And we will come back to many of these things in our discussion at the end. So thank you very much, Roseanne. Now, it's a pleasure now to introduce Richard Riley.